Every week, so much happens in your own country that it's hard to keep track of the news at home, let alone around the world. So in the next 8 minutes, I'm going to walk you through some of the week's biggest news, but we'll be moving fast. So if you want to find out more about any of the stories, then there's article recommendations in the description. This week's biggest stories include the outcome of the G7 meetings, Israel's parliament kicking out Benjamin Netanyahu, and Japan's controversial Olympics hitting some major bumps in the road. Before we start though, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and ring the bell to be notified every time we put out a new global news video. Thanks for your support. Probably the biggest global news this week comes out of Cornwall, England, where 7 of the world's biggest leaders met to discuss everything from the COVID recovery to the environment and global tax rates. This was the G7 summit, which not only saw the British Queen on top form.
There is a knife if you want.
I know there is. This is something that is more unusual.
Are you supposed to be looking as if you're enjoying it?
Yes, definitely.
But also some very serious discussions. As we discussed last week, before the conference even began, the leaders and their finance ministers had approved a plan to introduce a global corporate tax rate. But one of the biggest developments this weekend regarded climate, with the leaders committing to keeping global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. This is the first time that these global leaders have all committed to such a stark climate strategy. And to make it possible, they've approved some specific strategies, including a plan to downscale coal power plants, with plans set out to close coal power plants which don't use carbon capture technology to mitigate their environmental impact. This is a big step too, with coal being one of the dirtiest forms of power, and limiting its usage is key to preventing further environmental damage. In addition to limiting their own usage, the G7 nations have also committed to spending £2 billion to help developing nations transition away from coal. These plans were, however, tainted by a lack of clarity surrounding the plans and a complete lack of timeline for the transition, leading some to worry if it will ever come to fruition. The G7 countries also went further though, with a proposed £100 billion set to be spent each year on a Green Belt and Road scheme, which will contribute to the global fight against climate change. This money would primarily be spent helping poorer nations, supporting their growth through green investment and industry, not only helping the environment but also countering China's global infrastructure dominance and diplomacy. However, some have also criticised these plans, with one observer in the room at the G7 commenting it was very short on detail for how this would be achieved, as well as other green experts criticising the lack of detail in the plans. Despite the name of the plan directly referring to the Chinese scheme of a similar name, world leaders have insisted that they don't want to be anti-China, with agreement that they ought to work with China on issues like climate. On top of that, countries also discussed plans to phase out petrol and diesel vehicles. Johnson announced a £500 million Blue Planet Fund to contribute towards the protection of the world's oceans, and leaders committed to protecting 30% of the planet's land and oceans by 2030. Brexit was also a contentious topic at G7, but we discussed that in another video which we've linked down below. So if you want to find out more, check out the TLDR UK channel. Speaking of China, while leaders insisted that they wanted cooperation, it seems that the Asian superpower still isn't overly happy, remarking that the days where global decisions were dictated by a small group of countries are long gone. China will also prove to be a difficult subject at the NATO meetings also taking place this week. The country's growing military power will undoubtedly be a major topic of conversation for the military alliance, but there's little agreement over how the superpower should be handled, or how much of a threat they truly are. Countries like the US, UK and France are deploying ships to carry out freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea, but other members of NATO, like Hungary, have strong relationships with China and don't want to see a rift formed. If you want to find out more about NATO and other similar military alliances, then check out our recent video. Staying in China, research from the Financial Times shows quite how impacted the country could be from rising sea levels, driven by climate change, which they're helping to fuel. These maps show parts of China's coastal region, with the darkness of the colouring showing how much financial damage could be caused by rising sea levels and flooding, with Shanghai alone at nearly $1 trillion worth of potential GDP damage. Sea levels aren't likely to damage infrastructure and investment for many years to come, but in the words of the FT study, intensifying floods, storm damage, and soil erosion, as well as reduced freshwater supplies, threaten to undermine economic growth far before then. Across the water in Japan, there's increasing controversy surrounding the upcoming Olympic Games, which are set to go ahead with limited capacity and precautions in place despite the pandemic. Protests aren't common in Japan, but this issue has become an unlikely spark to start a major protest movement, with the majority of those in the country wanting the Games to either be cancelled or delayed again, largely out of concern about the spread of COVID. Despite assurances from the government and measures being put in place to mitigate potential impact, many aren't convinced and say that even a handful of additional COVID deaths are too many, with some decrying the IOC for focusing on profit rather than health, putting Japan in the position where they can't cancel the Games without facing financial damage. It's not just the public though, with more than 10,000 volunteers quitting in recent weeks. This is in part due to people objecting to the event, but it's also not been helped by the fact that job adverts have circulated online suggesting that paid staff will essentially be conducting the same work as volunteers. With no international visitors to welcome and the risk of a pandemic, some volunteers were left wondering why they'd work for free when others are getting paid. We've spoken about Israel a fair bit on the channel recently, but on Sunday, the country's parliament voted on the proposed coalition which would end Netanyahu's 12 years at the top. With a razor-thin 60-59 majority, the parliament approved the new coalition, meaning that right-wing Naftali Bennett has been sworn in as the country's prime minister until 2023, when it will be handed over to centrist Yair Lapid. Netanyahu didn't go down without a fight though, attempting to scupper the coalition in the days leading up to the vote, and remarking during the final debate that they'd be back. He might be right too, because while Netanyahu's party might not have secured a majority or a coalition, they're still the largest party in the parliament, and with a coalition made up of vastly different parties whose primary objective was getting Netanyahu out, it's possible that they might not last long united, and Netanyahu could return yet. Two more quick stories before we end. You've likely heard about this already, but after 7,000 participants placed bids, the opportunity to take a trip to space with Amazon founder Jeff Bezos sold for $28 million this weekend. This is obviously an astronomical amount of money, especially considering that the entire journey is set to only last about 10 minutes from launch to landing, of which only about 3 minutes will be in the zero gravity of space. The identity of the bidder is yet to be announced, but if they're spending $9 million per minute of space time, it's safe to say they've got a good amount of cash. Finally, you might be aware of some of the issues associated with Brexit, some of which were even discussed at the G7 meeting. But one problem hasn't got quite as much press: alcohol. It's no secret that Brits like to drink, but that might be getting harder, with many bars in the UK struggling to get the supplies they need from Europe. Brands such as Birra Moretti, Aperol, Tequila, Cointreau and Kahlua have all become harder to find because of Brexit, with some also blaming shortages on people purchasing home bars during lockdown. One spirit, though, will be especially sorely missed: Pessoa, which is one of the hardest to find currently and a key ingredient in Britain's favourite cocktail, the Pornstar Martini. Hopefully, for the sake of bottomless brunches across the country, the popular spirit will be back in stock soon, but it seems like the UK might be on for a dry spell. So those were some of the biggest global news stories from the last week, and if 8 minutes wasn't enough for you, then there's links to further reading in the description. If you think we missed anything major, then be sure to let us know in the comments the stories you'd like to see us cover in future episodes. Make sure you're subscribed and ring the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.